Inside Emerald Haven Wildlife Park, a zookeeper put on a show for the visitors at the expense of a helpless baby chimp. What he didn't realize: Shaquille O'Neal was in the audience. It was a quiet Tuesday morning. The parking lot stretched out in front of the entrance, nearly empty, except for a few yellow school buses parked neatly in their designated spots. The air was still, the only sounds coming from birds in the distance. A black SUV rolled into the lot. The door swung open, and out stepped Shaq, dressed casually, his frame nearly swallowing the simple brown hat he wore to stay low-key. He pressed his phone to his ear, locking his car with the other hand. "Yeah, I just got here," his deep voice rumbled through the empty space. On the other end, his friend sounded apologetic. Man, I know this was last minute, but you gotta try to make it. It's not every day all the NBA legends get together like this." Shaq sighed, adjusting his hat as he walked toward the entrance. I know. That's why I'm trying to move this meeting up. I made a commitment first, though. Gotta handle this before anything else. We get it, big man. Just do what you can. Wouldn't be the same without you. As he neared the entrance, a zoo staff member straightened up, clearly not expecting him. "And Mr. O'Neal, we weren't expecting you for a couple more hours." Shaq gave a polite nod. "Yeah, had a schedule change. Thought I'd come early, hope that's cool." The employee fumbled for their walkie-talkie. Right. The owners at the vet clinic, they trailed off, relaying the message. As Shaq waited, his thoughts drifted back to the reunion. The idea of missing even part of it stung, catching up with old teammates, reminiscing about their glory days. It was rare for all of them to be in the same room again. He could turn around right now, leave this meeting for another day. But no. He made a promise. And Shaq prided himself on keeping his word. "Mr. O'Neal?" The staff member's voice snapped him back. "I can take you to the clinic now." Shaq followed them through the quiet pathways of the park. The place was still waking up, early morning keepers tending to enclosures, the occasional distant call of an exotic bird, the low, guttural rumble of a big cat stretching in its habitat. "So, first time visiting our zoo, Mr. O'Neal?" the staff member asked, trying to fill the silence. "Yeah. Heard good things, though." "Oh, definitely." They perked up. "We might not be the biggest, but we take a lot of pride in our animal care and conservation efforts." Shaq only half listened. His mind kept flicking back to the reunion, wondering who would be there, what stories would be told. He needed to speed things up. They rounded a corner, and the veterinary clinic came into view, a squat, no-nonsense building. "Here we are," the staff member announced, motioning to the entrance. Inside, the clinic was bright, sterile, and quiet. A receptionist looked up, eyes widening slightly. "Mr. O'Neal is here to see Mr. Gallagher," the staffer explained. The receptionist nodded, picking up the phone. Shaq barely noticed. His attention was locked on something else, a large glass window looking into a treatment room. Through it, he saw a small chimpanzee lying on an exam table. A veterinarian, a young woman in a white coat, was carefully administering an injection. Beside her, a man in a suit, probably the zoo owner, watched closely. Shaq stepped closer to the glass. The chimp was tiny, motionless except for the faintest rise and fall of its breath. Something about the scene sat wrong with him. "Mr. O'Neal?" The receptionist's voice barely registered. He didn't move. Didn't blink. His brow furrowed. Something wasn't right. As Shaq watched through the glass, he couldn't shake the feeling of concern for the tiny chimp. What had happened to bring it here? Was it sick? Injured? The way the vet moved, careful, precise, but quick, told him she had done this plenty of times before. Then, suddenly, she looked up and froze. Her eyes widened in recognition, and she immediately tapped the man in the suit beside her. The owner of the zoo. The man turned, following her gaze, and when he spotted Shaq watching through the window, his eyebrows lifted in surprise. He quickly pulled off his gloves, washed his hands, and stepped out of the treatment room. "Mr. O'Neill," he greeted, extending a hand. "Martin Gallagher. I wasn't expecting you for another couple of hours." Shaq tore his eyes away from the glass and shook the man's hand. "Yeah, sorry about that. Had a schedule conflict come up, figured I'd swing by earlier if that works for you." Martin's polite smile tightened just a little as he glanced toward his staff. "I see. Well, I wasn't informed you'd be arriving ahead of schedule. We could have been better prepared." The young receptionist looked nervous. "I'm sorry, Mr. Gallagher, I only just got the call from the front desk. You were in the middle of the treatment, and I didn't want to interrupt." Martin raised a hand, cutting off the apology. "It's all right. What's done is done." He turned back to Shaq, his voice smooth and professional. "I do apologize for the confusion, Mr. O'Neill. As you saw, we were in the middle of treating one of our animals." Shaq's gaze flickered back to the window. "Yeah, I saw. That little guy doing okay?" Martin followed his line of sight. "Oh, yes. Just a routine checkup and a vitamin booster. Nothing to worry about. Young primates, much like human children, have developing immune systems, so we take extra precautions." Shaq nodded, impressed. "Good to hear. Nice to see your hands-on, not just leaving everything to your staff." That seemed to land well. Martin's smile turned more genuine. "Thank you. We take pride in our commitment to the animal's well-being." He gestured toward the door. "Shall we step outside? The young one is resting, and we try to keep things quiet in here." As they walked out into the crisp morning air, Shaq felt a mix of emotions. On one hand, he was impressed by the level of care he'd seen. On the other, he still had that nagging feeling, the one reminding him that, right now, somewhere else, his old teammates were gathering, catching up, and sharing stories. And he was missing it. Martin, meanwhile, continued talking. "As you can see, Mr. O'Neill, we take a very hands-on approach to animal care here at Emerald Haven. It's something we're quite proud of." Shaq scanned the nearby enclosures, nodding. "That's great. Always been a big believer in personal involvement." But then Martin's tone shifted slightly. "That being said, we do face challenges. We're not a large facility. We don't have the funding that the bigger zoos do, and that makes it hard to maintain the level of care we strive for." Shaq nodded slowly, his mind already working through possible solutions. "I get that. So, about our meeting, any chance we could move it up? I've got an important event later." Martin's expression remained polite, but firm. "I'm terribly sorry, Mr. O'Neill, but that won't be possible. I have scheduled meetings with local reporters and several pressing animal care matters that can't be postponed. I know your time is valuable, but I hope you understand." Despite his celebrity status, Shaq was met with a clear, yet apologetic, no. A flicker of frustration crossed his mind. The reunion. The stories. The chance to relive the good old days. He was missing it. But he had made a commitment here first. Shaq inhaled deeply, pushing the disappointment aside. "I understand. No worries. I'll just take a look around on my own for a bit, if that's all right." Martin nodded, looking relieved. "Absolutely. Take your time. If you need anything, just ask our staff. We'll meet at the originally scheduled time in my office, and I'll have someone escort you there." With that, Martin hurried off, leaving Shaq standing in the quiet morning atmosphere of the zoo. The place was still mostly empty, aside from a few scattered school groups, teachers guiding wide-eyed preschoolers through the exhibits. Adjusting his brown hat, Shaq started walking. At first, he just took in the sights. Enclosures of exotic animals, the sounds of birds overhead, the distant roar of a big cat waking up for the day. He appreciated the anonymity this early hour offered, no cameras, no fans, just him and the animals. But then, something felt off. The enclosures looked fine, clean, well maintained. But the animals inside? That was a different story. Many of them seemed off, listless, sluggish. Some looked too thin. Shaq's frown deepened. He thought back to what Martin had said about financial struggles. He had read about it before, how zoos, especially smaller ones, often struggled to break even. How some, out of desperation, cut corners. But was that what was happening here? Or was it something worse? Shaq continued his slow walk through the zoo, his mind at war with itself. He could see the effort being put into caring for the animals, the staff seemed dedicated, and the enclosures were clean. But something still felt off. The animals didn't look mistreated, but they also didn't look thriving. The resources just weren't there. And the more he saw, the more he felt it. When he reached the primate section, Shaq paused by the chimpanzee enclosure. Several mother chimps were interacting with their young, their bonds unmistakable. It was the kind of connection that went beyond species, something deeply familiar and instinctive. He watched for a moment, feeling a quiet sense of admiration. But then, something tugged at his gut. The enclosure, though well-maintained, felt small. The chimpanzees had room to move, but not enough to truly roam. They didn't seem distressed, but they weren't as lively as he'd expected either. They needed more space, more freedom. Lost in thought, Shaq barely noticed the sound of excited voices approaching. A group of preschoolers burst into view, their teacher, an early 30s guy with an easygoing energy, doing his best to keep them together. "All right, everyone, let's stay in line. We're going to learn all about." The teacher's words trailed off mid-sentence as his eyes landed on Shaq. For a second, he looked completely stunned, his gaze flickering between Shaq and the kids, as if debating whether to react. Shaq knew that look well. But to his surprise, the teacher quickly pulled himself together. He stepped forward, extending a hand with a polite, almost discreet approach. "Excuse me, Mr. O'Neill. I'm Travis. I hope I'm not intruding. I just wanted to say I'm a big fan. Don't worry, I won't cause a scene or anything. I get how valuable moments of peace can be." Shaq grinned, shaking his hand. "Man, I appreciate that. You seem to know a thing or two about needing some quiet time yourself," he said, nodding toward the hyperactive kids. Travis chuckled. "Oh, you have no idea. But I wouldn't trade it for anything." Then, hesitating for just a moment, he added, "Would you mind if we got a quick photo? Just for me, no social media, I promise." Shaq, impressed by the guy's respectful attitude, nodded. "Sure thing." They snapped a quick selfie, and Shaq even signed Travis's hat before the teacher turned back to his students. "Oh, by the way," Travis added over his shoulder, "there's a chimpanzee show starting in about 15 minutes. It's pretty educational, talks about their intelligence, how similar they are to us. Might be worth checking out." Shaq nodded. "Appreciate the tip, man." Travis gave a small wave and headed back to his class. Shaq checked his watch. He still had about an hour before his rescheduled meeting with Martin. The idea of an educational program on chimps actually sounded interesting. He'd always been fascinated by their intelligence. But before he could make a decision, his phone rang. Stepping away from the crowd, he answered. "Hey man," Shaq said, his voice tinged with regret. "Looks like I won't be able to make it on time. Couldn't move up the meeting here, but I'll definitely be there, even if I'm late, all right?" His friend on the other end sighed, but Shaq could hear the understanding in his voice. "We'll save you a seat, big man. Just get here when you can." Ending the call, Shaq exhaled, rolling his shoulders. He had time to kill. Might as well check out the show. As he approached the showroom entrance, he noticed a steady stream of kids and teachers filing in. At least 3 different school groups had gathered, their voices creating an excited hum in the air. Rather than push through the crowd, Shaq hung back, watching. His mind drifted back to the little chimpanzee in the clinic earlier. Was it okay now? Did it have family here, in the enclosure he had just seen? Sir? Shaq turned to see Travis approaching again, leading his preschoolers inside. Fancy seeing you here again, Travis said with a grin. Thinking of catching the show? Shaq smirked. Yeah, thought it might be interesting. You bringing your class in? Absolutely, Travis said. First time our school has visited here, so I'm hoping the kids enjoy learning about how intelligent chimps are. He paused for a moment, then tilted his head. All right then, I'll get the kids inside. You coming? Shaq nodded. Sure. But I'll stick to the back row. With a knowing smile, Travis led Shaq through the entrance and discreetly guided him to a seat in the far corner, away from most of the crowd. The room buzzed with excitement. Kids chattered while teachers tried to keep them settled, and a few scattered tourists filled the remaining seats. The anticipation for the show was evident. While waiting, Shaq idly pulled out his phone and started scrolling through articles about chimpanzees. One article in particular caught his attention. It detailed how human respiratory viruses could spread to great apes, sometimes with devastating consequences. The article explained how even a simple cold could become fatal for primates, whose immune systems weren't equipped to handle human diseases. Shaq's brow furrowed. He thought back to the chimp in the clinic. If it had been sick, could it have caught something from a human? From a visitor? Maybe even from the show itself? That unsettled feeling in his gut returned. And then, the lights dimmed. The show was about to begin. But before he could say a word, Martin Gallagher appeared at the end of the hallway, his expression a mix of confusion and barely restrained frustration. What the hell is going on? Martin asked, his gaze darting between the security guards and Shaq. One of the guards straightened. Mr. Gallagher, this visitor was causing a disruption during the show. Shaq cut him off, his voice calm but firm. That chimp is sick. Martin blinked. What? The baby chimp. Mellow. I saw it in the clinic earlier. It was getting treated, and now it's up there being paraded around for a crowd? That's not right, man. Martin's lips pressed into a thin line. Mr. O'Neill, I can assure you, we take the health of our animals very seriously. If the chimpanzee was cleared for public interaction, then there was no. That chimp ain't fine, Shaq interrupted, his massive arms crossing over his chest. I've been watching it. It's sluggish, barely reacting, turning away from food. It was just in medical care, and now it's being forced to perform? That don't add up. Martin hesitated. He glanced at the security guards, then back at Shaq, something flickering behind his eyes. Look, Shaq continued, lowering his voice just enough to keep the conversation between them, I get that running a zoo is tough. I get that money's tight. But if you're putting sick animals on display just to keep visitors entertained, that's a problem. For the first time, Martin looked uncertain. Shaq could tell the man was weighing his options. He wasn't just some random guest making a scene, he was Shaquille O'Neal, and the last thing this place needed was bad press from someone with his platform. Martin exhaled sharply. Fine. Follow me. Without another word, he turned on his heel and walked toward a restricted side door, nodding for Shaq to follow. The security guards exchanged glances but didn't intervene. Shaq followed Martin down a quiet service corridor, the noise of the showroom fading behind them. You're putting me in a tough spot, Mr. O'Neill, Martin muttered as they walked. No, man, Shaq said, shaking his head. The people running that show? They put you in a tough spot. I'm just pointing it out. They reached another staff-only door, and Martin punched in a security code. The door clicked open, leading them into a small backroom adjacent to the primate enclosure. Inside, a young veterinarian, the same one from the clinic, was speaking in hushed tones with another staff member. When she saw Martin, she straightened, clearly tense. Dr. Patel, Martin said, keeping his voice level. Mr. O'Neill here has some concerns about Mello. Shaq watched her reaction carefully. There was a split second of hesitation before she spoke, and that was all he needed to see. Mello was cleared for public interaction, she said carefully. His condition wasn't serious enough to prevent him from participating in the show. Shaq's jaw tensed. Wasn't serious enough? He took a step forward, his towering presence suddenly very noticeable in the small room. So, what, you got a scale for that? 'Cause from where I was sitting, that little dude looked weak. Lethargic. You saw the same thing I did in that clinic. Dr. Patel shifted uncomfortably. Mr. O'Neill, I don't make the decisions about the show. I only provide medical assessments. The final call ain't yours, Shaq finished for her, glancing at Martin. Silence. Martin rubbed his temples. Damn it. The weight of the situation was finally sinking in. Shaq could see it in Martin's expression, the realization that he had messed up. That cutting corners, even just a little, had put him in a situation where a globally recognized figure was now standing in his back office calling him out. Shaq exhaled. Look, man, he said, voice softer now. I'm not here to put you on blast. But you gotta do better than this. If your zoo's struggling, don't let it be at the animal's expense. There's other ways to fix this, ways that don't involve forcing a sick baby chimp to perform for a bunch of school kids. Martin didn't respond right away. He just stared at the floor, something heavy in his expression. Finally, he looked up. I'll pull Mello from the show. Shaq nodded. Good. And if you're serious about keeping this place going the right way, maybe we need to talk about some real solutions. Martin's eyes flickered with something like relief. You'd be willing to help? Shaq shrugged. I don't make promises I can't keep. But I don't turn my back on something that needs fixing either. Martin nodded slowly. Then let's talk. Shaquille O'Neal's visit to Emerald Haven Wildlife Park was supposed to be a routine stop, just a quick tour before heading to an NBA Legends reunion. But what started as a simple visit quickly turned into something far more serious when he witnessed a disturbing scene during a chimpanzee show. Seated at the back of the dimly lit showroom, Shaq initially watched with mild curiosity as the zookeeper, Greg Mathers, introduced the star of the show, a young chimpanzee named Mello. But as soon as the small primate was led onto the stage, Shaq's interest turned into deep concern. The chimp was chained at the ankles, its movements slow and lethargic, its eyes dull and unfocused. Shaq's gut twisted. He had seen this same chimp just hours earlier in the zoo's veterinary clinic, receiving medical treatment. What was it doing on stage? And why did it look even worse now than it had in the clinic? As the performance went on, Shaq's unease grew. Mello was being forced to perform tricks, riding a tricycle, balancing on a ball, waving at the audience, all while clearly struggling. The small primate flinched when Greg suddenly clapped his hands near its face, eliciting a nervous reaction meant to amuse the crowd. But Shaq wasn't laughing. Something wasn't right. The final straw came when a group of children was invited forward to feed Mello. The chimp barely reacted, turning its head away from the food, another red flag. A healthy, young chimpanzee should have been eager to eat, but Mello looked exhausted, disengaged, unwell. Shaq couldn't sit back anymore. He stood up, his massive frame instantly drawing attention, and called out in his deep, commanding voice. Hey! What's going on here? That chimp looks sick. Greg, momentarily startled, tried to brush off the concern. Sir, please take your seat. You're disrupting the show. But Shaq wasn't backing down. That animal doesn't look well. You're putting both the kids and the chimp at risk. The room fell into a tense silence. Some parents began pulling their children back, sensing Shaq's intensity. Even the teacher he had met earlier, Travis, looked uneasy, keeping his students at a distance. Greg's face hardened. I told you to calm down, sir. You're the one making a scene. The confrontation escalated, and before Shaq knew it, security guards were escorting him out of the showroom. But Shaq wasn't leaving because he had caused a disturbance. He was leaving because he had just uncovered something deeply wrong with this place. A hidden truth. As he stepped outside, Martin Gallagher, the zoo's owner, rushed over, clearly confused by the commotion. "Mr. O'Neill, is everything all right?" The security guards, now realizing who they had just removed, looked mortified. "We're so sorry, Mr. O'Neill," one of them stammered. "We didn't realize it was you." But Shaq waved them off. "It's not me you should be worried about," he said, his voice tight with frustration. "It's what's happening in that showroom. That chimp, Mello, something's not right." Martin's face paled slightly. "I'm sure it's nothing serious, Mr. O'Neill," he said quickly. "Our animals receive the best care possible." Shaq wasn't buying it. "Then explain why that baby chimp looks drugged," he pressed, his voice low but intense. "And why it's chained up and being forced to do tricks when it's clearly sick." Martin glanced around nervously, aware that onlookers were gathering. Lowering his voice, he suggested, "Perhaps we should discuss this in my office." Shaq hesitated. He wanted nothing more than to storm back into that showroom and shut the whole thing down, but he knew a calmer approach might get him more answers. He nodded and followed Martin toward the administrative offices, his mind racing with questions and suspicions. An ominous discovery. Inside the office, Martin swore up and down that he had no idea Greg was using such harsh training methods. He even promised to take action against the zookeeper. But Shaq wasn't letting him off that easily. "It's not just about Greg," he said. "I've been walking around all morning. Your enclosures look clean, but a lot of these animals seem thin, tired, like they need better care." Martin sighed, rubbing his temples. "You're right," he admitted. "We've been struggling financially. We need donor support to make real improvements." Shaq understood. Zoos rarely made a profit and often relied on outside funding. But drugging animals for entertainment? That was crossing the line. Martin insisted that Mello wasn't drugged, claiming the chimp had just received a vitamin booster. Still, he promised to investigate the matter further. Shaq, wanting to give the zoo a chance to do the right thing, decided to donate money, but only on one condition. No more exploitative shows. Focus on education and conservation. Relief washed over Martin's face as Shaq signed the check. But before leaving, Shaq realized he had left his hat behind in the showroom. That's when everything took a dark turn. The truth comes out. Returning to the showroom, Shaq overheard Martin and Greg talking in hushed voices. "Do you have any idea what could have happened if the press saw those chains?" Martin snapped. Greg's voice was defensive. "I was scared the sedative wouldn't be enough to keep Mello calm. I thought we still needed the chains." Martin's response sent a chill down Shaq's spine. "Next time, increase the dose of acipromazine. We can't risk another incident like this." They had been drugging the chimp all along. Shaq stepped into the doorway, his towering figure blocking the exit. "There won't be a next time." Martin and Greg whirled around, their faces twisting in panic and fear as they realized Shaq had heard everything. When Martin tried to threaten him, Shaq pulled out his phone, snapping photo evidence of Mello's condition and the chains lying nearby. Greg lunged toward him, but Shaq was quicker. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," he warned, his voice low and dangerous. "Unless you want assault charges on top of everything else." Ignoring their protests, Shaq sent the photos to his assistant, who immediately tipped off the press. Within minutes, news crews and animal rights activists began arriving. The scandal erupted nationwide. As Shaq drove away, watching the zoo descend into chaos through his rearview mirror, he knew one thing for certain. This fight wasn't over. He had come to Emerald Haven as just another visitor. He was leaving as a man on a mission.